This is the Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Joe Cohen from Queens College in the City University of New York.
I'm Nga Tan from City University of New York.
I'm Ellen Meiser from the University of Hawaii.
And today we're going to talk to Matt Rafalow of Google. Matt recently published Digital Divisions, How Schools Create Inequality in the Tech Era with the University of Chicago Press. It's a look at how social inequality permeates the use of classroom technology. We're talking education, technology, inequality, race, class, and much more. Stay tuned. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you back. You might remember Matt from last spring season when we did an episode on using technology in the classroom. Matt, the episode received a great response, and I really loved hearing from you in a pretty hairy transition online. So it's great to have you back to talk about your new book, Digital Divisions, How Schools Create Inequality in the Tech Era with the University of Chicago Press. So welcome, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome.
For years, one of the big concerns surrounding inequality in technology involved questions about the digital divide in terms of differences to access in technology or exposure to basic tech skills. We were worried about whether kids from less wealthy families had sufficient access to things like computers or fast internet connections. And we were worried if they were learning how to use it. Like, were they learning to type? Were they learning to program? Were they learning how to use basic internet functions? And this kind of digital device, it's still very much with us. That's for sure. You can see it with COVID. But Matt's book is interesting because you're arguing that there's more to the digital divide than these basic sort of access and usage skills. Can you tell us a little bit more about your book?
Yeah, sure. You're 100% right on. I think a lot of the thinking around digital divides are pretty much, that the holy grail is one laptop per child, or providing complete access to needed technologies and high quality internet in order to do well. Almost like kind of providing these access, solving these access gaps is like, the holy grail, and that will magically see gains and achievement once those gaps are closed. Folks who study digital divides, incidentally think of digital divides on three levels. There's not just one digital divide, there's three, which sounds very overwhelming now that I'm saying it out loud. But the first is access. The second is digital skills, what you're referring to, Joe. Can people use it? Which I actually think teachers at this moment are, no offense to all of us, are a little behind in some respects compared to a lot of young folks. And then the third, which is the bulk of the study of my book, is on unequal use. Even if people know how to use the technologies and have the technologies, people will use technologies in different ways. And unfortunately, I find that they're using them in ways that are different based on the race and class of their student body. And that's the bulk of the focus of the book.
So can you give us maybe a story to flesh out this idea of this third divide?
Yeah. I love using the example of Minecraft because it epitomizes something from digital literacies research in kind of the education field that I'm using sociologically. Minecraft is essentially, a lot of parents are very familiar with this game, for better or for worse, when I've talked to them, but it's essentially a world building game. There used to be games like this when I was a kid that were text based, where people would build worlds with text, which sounds crazy. That's like a whole other discussion. But Minecraft is essentially, as a player, you're dropped into this big empty world, but you're given a set of tools to build. And the world is organized around building blocks, kind of like digital Legos. And as a player, you have to figure out how to assemble these Legos for different purposes. It could be entirely creative. You could build little cities and towns. It could be a little more competitive. You could try to avoid, something like a zombie apocalypse. there's many different ways to play. But the idea that learning scholars were so excited about with this game is that it was not too different from how we're expecting schools to teach digital skills, learning how to communicate with each other, learning how to create digital things. These are actually baked in to the very requirements for middle schools, for example, in teaching digital skills to kids. And so I was like, holy cow, like this could be a great way for kids to get ahead. If they're already playing around online, maybe schools could help them out. And as I talk about in the book, there's some theory from cultural sociology and education that argues that this is the dilemma we're trying to solve. Unequal childhoods, for example, which is at its heart a Bourdieuian take on educational inequity, argues that working class kids just don't learn the same skills that wealthy kids do due to class inequities. And so wealthy kids they show up at school on an unequal footing. And so this is like a case to really dig into that. Like, is that the case? Like, will we see if kids are all playing Minecraft and learning how to use digital technologies, will they get ahead? So I love using the example of Minecraft because it came up in these schools a lot. So for example, how did this play out differently? Well, I studied 3 middle schools. One I call Heathcliff Academy, which is a private school serving mostly wealthy white kids. Another, Sheldon Junior High, which serves mostly Asian American middle class kids. And a third, Cesar Chavez Middle School. These are all pseudonyms, of course, that serves mostly working class Latinx kids. And when Minecraft showed up at these schools, teachers treated it so differently. At Heathcliff, for example, when I talked to teachers, they all thought their kids were basically like these future Steve Jobs, like everything they're doing it with play online. Oh my God, it's going to be so helpful in school. And so there was one, class that I observed where students were working independently on their iPads, and importantly, all the schools had tons of technology available to them to use. They were playing around with their iPads, but on an assignment about ancient Egypt, and it had nothing to do with video games. But one kid in the class that I was observing, I was like, wait a second, is this kid playing Minecraft in class? They were. And a teacher was walking around the room and saw that they were playing and like leaned over their shoulder and were like, just started asking them questions like, what are you doing? Like, wait, is that from Egypt? Like, did you build like a pyramid? And they're like, yeah. Like, how did you build that? They just started asking all these questions. And then after enough questions, he just kind of clapped his hands and was like, everybody, I want you to gather around, look at what this student's doing. And they turned the lesson into an activity around Minecraft. One other example of what this was like somewhere else, and we could go into each of the schools, but at Sheldon, the school for mostly middle class Asian American students, teachers actually saw kids' skills from online play much differently. There, they assumed that play was threatening. It wasn't essential like at Heathcliff. It was threatening. And to explain it, they really drew on a lot of really unfair characterizations, racialized assumptions about their students. And I'll be sharing stereotypes probably throughout this talk, caveat that, they could sit with people pretty uncomfortably, but I don't want to shy away from them because these were part of the life of these schools.
Yeah,
but
you're reporting what you saw, not what you think.
Exactly. Yeah. But honestly, over and over, teachers at Sheldon described their students as these hackers. These, they were raised by tiger moms who trapped them in their rooms to study. Like, these are the kind of assumptions they had, and that these kids would do anything to do well with or without technology. And so they saw digital play then as a threat to their achievement. And so anytime a video game showed up, kids were playing Minecraft, whatever, it didn't matter what they were doing. They would snatch their phones away. They would give them detention, sometimes suspensions. They would put their phones in the phone box at the front of the school. They would do, like, even more than that. They would use their wireless access at school to track the IP addresses of students, to link all online behaviors to the individual students. There was one example where a teacher was proudly telling me that he printed out text messages that students were sending to one another to show the kid in class, I am collecting this, you are doing wrong, to scare them into realizing that what their play online is bad for school. And so those are just kind of two examples of how Minecraft can be treated differently. And really, Minecraft represents play online, the skills that kids have online, and how teachers differently enable them by the race and class of their student body.
I was thinking, during my the past couple of years, for extra money on the side, I was subbing at the local school district, which is primarily like Black and Latinx. It's actually, I think, 80% Latinx students.
Mm-hmm.
And Minecraft was huge, huge, huge across elementary and middle school. By high school, of course, they're doing other things, but elementary and middle school, it was a big thing for them. I mean, little kids would run around making, paper swords that look like Minecraft swords because, that's what they were having fun with. Yep. And it seems like, at least from my observations, that around last year, this time, Minecraft became kind of pushed aside by Fortnite and other new games. So I'm curious what, Fortnite is a far more violent game than Minecraft. Minecraft, at least, like, there's some kind of Sims quality to it that I always thought was kind of fun. But yeah, do you have any insight into how more violent games are treated by schools?
Yeah, I definitely think when violent, like games that teachers explicitly thought were violent or bad, like, for example, and I would still argue even in some of these violent, like there's clearly a qualitative difference between like Call of Duty and some other kind of games. Like, I still think there's some value in online communication and collaboration. Like, you could kind of make a case for it. But I think more importantly, teachers had assumptions about different types of games. And even at Heathcliff, the school that, that served wealthy white students, that valorized kids' digital skills, when a student was caught playing Grand Theft Auto, for example, that became, they would have suspended the student if it was at a different school, but that became cause to call the parents and have a discussion,
right.
So, but I do think, like, importantly, what I mean by video games in this context is kids' digital interests or kids' interests broadly. It could be social media use, it could be gaming, it could be online writing or creativity. As a researcher of youth culture, there's a rich history of scholarship on kids' interests being devalued depending on their race and class. So, like, Prudence Carter, Angela Valenzuela, like, they've all written about how Black and Latinx kids, interests, what they care about, are systematically devalued by the mostly white middle class educational institutions that run them. And so I really draw on their work, extending it to just the case of kids' digital interests, to show how teachers, like, really there's a mechanism at the teacher level that is, they are gatekeeping whether those skills matter or not, whether those interests matter or not for learning.
So there were new technologies that teachers pretty much agreed could be the gateway towards students finding new ways to learn. Minecraft is one of them, and it does have a lot of sort of skill building aspects to it. But what you're saying is, even though the same technology was available, that technology was filtered through teachers' attitudes towards the children. And teachers created a classroom environment in which the students related to the technology differently. And that lesson, the lesson implicit in teachers' views of how they relate to the technology, was, to your mind, putting them on different paths in life or training them to approach the world in a different way. Wealthy kids were taught that what they're doing is great and, be a creator, let your imagination run wild. And you're saying at the middle school of the middle class Asian students, they were like, listen, this is a waste of time. Get back to job skills. Don't create, learn to program. Am I getting sort of the gist of it?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that resonates so well with is, I'm really drawing on Bowles and Gintis's thinking around how schools are guiding students into different kind of economic career trajectories. I mean, they famously argued at a very high level. They weren't kind of on the ground like I was or some other scholars who have studied this. That schools serving working class kids are socializing into them, skills, perspectives that will really guide them on a path to working class jobs. Whereas schools serving wealthy kids, they're treated like future CEOs, and that's guiding them towards wealthier, economic trajectories. I think where I try to intervene is to show how that occurs. It occurs through how teachers discipline the value of kids' creativity as expressed through these interests. And this is why, it sounds silly, like we're talking about video games, but it's really a way to excavate how Marxist thinking about the value of creativity in relation to labor can affect how kids see their own creative worth in institutions and later on in economic opportunity. If even though at the school for serving mostly working class Latinx kids, even though they weren't, in my study, they weren't treating them so tough as they did at Sheldon, the other school. They were still telling them that what their play amounted to was kind of irrelevant for school. Like it just didn't matter, that's for fun. When you want to work, it's to learn basic skills to get a job someday. And that
Hmm.
I think really shows the power of this thinking that we draw on from Marx in this work is that, it's a form of alienation, is that you're telling kids that their creative selves will not help them,
Mhm.
in their labor outcomes. Whereas at Heathcliff, the school serving mostly wealthy white kids, they're told that who they are creatively is essential to doing well in the world. And so everything these kids learn to do is, digital or not, is in the service of bringing in their creative genius, which I think all kids have, into
Mhm.
their labor market trajectory. So I try to divide the book up into, it really helped in my thinking in the book to divide it up into what the mechanisms are. The first bit is about how they do this. That's by gatekeeping whether kids' creativity matters or not to school. The second part, which was very complicated, was why. Where are teachers getting these ideas from? And at a pretty basic level, I think, I thought of it as attitudes for sure. It's like they just have these assumptions about kids that shape how they're treating their play. But it does come from a pretty complex mixture, I found, of racial stereotypes that they have and workplace conditions that teachers deal with.
Well, can you flesh that out for us? Like, what's the causal story here in your mind?
Sure. Yeah, this was one of the most complicated puzzles from to try to figure out. I mean, one of the things that struck me is that the literature from, the race literature and race and education literature clearly paints a picture that, the mostly white teachers that are working at these schools have racial stereotypes. So that's, pretty not controversial. What's also not controversial from this literature is that there's a lot of stereotypes. One of the things that really struck me when I was interviewing these teachers is that they had varied stereotypes about their students. But it was confusing too, because it seemed like in interviews, in different breaths, when describing students they've worked with at different schools, they had different stereotypes about the same racial ethnic group of students that they were talking about, which was very confusing to me. How can you have, as an individual, a belief that Asian American students are model minorities, and then when describing students at another school that they're tiger mom raised hackers, and then in describing Latinx students that they've taught at one school, they would describe them as future gang members,
Mm.
whereas students at other schools, they would describe them as hardworking immigrants just trying to get ahead. This seemed to not make sense at all to me. And what
No.
was particularly interesting is that they only used one stereotype to describe the students at their current school. So at Sheldon, you know, as I was describing before, their students were hackers, and at Chavez, their students were hardworking immigrants. And so I really was, trying to figure out why it was that this was the case. And, eventually I got so frustrated that I just point blank shared what I was finding with the teachers. I was like, what do you think about this? Why are you telling me these confusing things? And they really helped me figure it out. I think most teachers, consistent with what a lot of race scholars have said about how white people react when they're confronted with their biases, kind of shut down. They were like, "Oh no, I don't have biases. No, what are you talking about?" But a few offered these really thoughtful takes that, like, I'll always remember this one quote from a teacher, I think at Chavez, who said, Matt, here at this school, it's like Disneyland compared to other schools I've taught at serving Latinx students, she meant. It's, teachers treat each other with respect, and that trickles down into how we treat these students. It's all about what you surround these students with. If you surround them with one thing, they'll act differently. And I was like, holy cow, like, ethnographers, a lot of us will be like, I got to follow this lead. This is gold. So what I did then is I interrogated that at each school. I just started asking what it was like to work at these schools. And I mean, oh my gosh, if you ask teachers about this, they'll regale you with stories about what it's like to work. Some places were like hellholes, some places were like Disneyland, and indeed, I found similar patterns in workplace culture and a literature on workplaces that's really not been adapted very well to study race. And I know you had Victor Ray on. He would agree. And his work really helped my thinking here too. But what I find is
Right.
that each school had different workplace cultures that differently guided the quote unquote appropriate stereotype that teachers drew on to
Right.
explain how they interacted with students. So, as one example, at Sheldon, teachers there described it as a hellhole. They said, the teachers described other women there in particular. It's like mean girls. They won't let you sit with them at lunch. It was really every man for himself. A lot of gendered
Mm.
terminology there, but that was the work, what it was like to work there. And so that every man for himself dynamic among faculty, I find shaped in a way that wasn't very deliberative. It was kind of automatic in terms of how culture worked here, but that every man for himself workplace dynamic enabled a perception of their Asian American students and their small group of Latinx students as threats rather
Mm.
than hardworking immigrants or model minorities. Similarly, at Chavez, um, this worked. This was at play as well. But faculty there, it was like a family. They described it as so collaborative, so kind. Faculty would help one another, and that trickled into how they treated their students too. But that family dynamic enabled them to see their mostly Latinx students as hardworking immigrants. Something like a future gang member stereotype was just inaccessible at an environment like that. Um, and so what I observed is that there's this super interesting interaction between workplace culture
Mm.
and the types of racial stereotypes, racialized and class kind of entangled stereotypes that teachers draw on to see their students' digital play.
It reminds me of, I remember that study a few years ago on mice, like where if the researcher would induce stress in a mouse, that mouse would lash out on other mice. And the act of lashing out against weaker mice had some type of homeostatic neurochemical, effect. Like people achieve balance by being tweaked, by tweaking those below them. And somehow it's believed that I remember that study. I wish I could look. I wish I had it on the tip of my head. But you know what else I'm wondering about? Like as somebody who's had exposure as a parent to a few different schools, like my children go to private school now,
Mhm.
and I've had some exposure to the public school system here, and I know of the New York City system. I wonder if the objective conditions that teachers work in, or like the objective situation that sustains the organization and shapes policy, plays a role here. For example, many private schools are very worried about losing students. Most private schools rely on each parent to continue contributing, and they always need the parent's money. And there's a very strong ethic of customer satisfaction. And a lot of these parents harbor, like many parents, think their children are the greatest people on earth. And they harbor the attitude that if my child is not being taught the way I want, I will take my money elsewhere. I live in a wealthy small town, and I'm a white person. And socially, in this context, there's very few degrees of separation between me and school board members. Or as a white person, I feel very confident in my ability to stand up at a meeting and talk about how the school wrongs my child, and see a room full of white people be able to sympathize with me, because they too are white and maybe they imagine their children in the same situation. Under both circumstances, with money or with race, I'm able to leverage power over my teachers and be more of a threat, and be in a greater position to demand, that my children be treated as special. When I contrast that with my experience working at CUNY, which is very attuned to the needs of students in needs, but like there's no leverage that our customers, our clients have over us. We're publicly funded. So what do you think of that idea? Like that the power dynamic of the parent over the teacher, using cultural or economic capital as a role here?
Yeah, I think it's essential. I think, especially in the case of Heathcliff, the private school that I studied, I did do a lot of work to try to minimize, all the different factors that could shape what I observed at these schools. So I did, each of the schools, private or public, had a lot of technology. They had a vision for how to, enable technology use. Testing was miraculously not an issue the year I was there, because of a rollout of a new, computerized exam. But even despite that, I found that at Heathcliff, parents really ruled the land. They really, really ruled the land in ways that trickled into the classroom. And even though at other schools, specifically at Sheldon, the school of mostly Asian American middle class kids, parents there tried to get involved, but teachers would engage in all sorts of different tactics to diminish the power that they had, in ways that were not equal at Heathcliff. I mean, one of the things that I loved, just kind of narratively, hearing teachers describe at Heathcliff, was that they talked about, how did they put it? Like baking, like parents baking as one of the mechanisms by which parents asserted their control day to day in the classroom. So, for example, teachers or parents all the time would say, like, "Oh, I'm gonna bring in cupcakes for." Remember, these are middle school kids, so I'm gonna bring in cupcakes to the class and bring in brownies, things like that. They would always do it unannounced. They would just show up in the class and put them in like literally while teachers are doing their work. And really, there was nothing the teachers could do about it, because at face value they're just bringing in food. But teachers would also tell me that these are surveillance mechanisms for the parents to use to kind of keep an eye on what their teachers are doing. And the effect of that, I heard all these examples, and it really trickled into technology use too. If they didn't observe teachers using the latest and greatest, kind of exciting ways to use tech in the classroom, or they weren't treating their kids like future Steve Jobs, they would say something to the principal. It would end up getting to the teacher or put them on blast. Teachers would be pitted against each other for not doing right by their kids. And so all of that amounted to a workplace culture of treating kids like elites. If you didn't, as a teacher, treat these children like elites, down to literally, I observed teachers, saying, "My little historians, my little scientists," like that would be what they do in class, which is like kind of idyllic as a kid. Let's be real. I think that's pretty cool. But, at a meta level, only these kind of wealthy white kids are getting that experience, and teachers are being pressured to doing it because parents are waving their influence over them.
What was that? Remember that finding? Oh, darn. I'm just coming up so bad with the citations, but remember that finding a few years ago? It was an experiment that argued that it was the real difference with class was the confidence projected, and people of higher social classes or in privileged status categories like men or white people were more likely to present their ideas or thoughts as authoritative, and people in the room would use the authoritative tone or manner to infer competency. Do you remember? Do you remember that finding? So it's sort of like that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Bourdieuians who try to map a lot of that work out in the classroom, I think have done a really good job showing that in practice. Like, I mean, I have to tout Jess Calarco's work on
Yeah, for sure.
just, you know, kids knowing when and how to ask questions in class. Like, all of that stuff
Yeah.
really matters and systematically privileges, um, wealthy kids. I would argue wealthy white kids, from my work. But one of the things that I add to that thinking is that schools also, um, provide a socialization process that instills that confidence in kids too. I mean, when I interviewed these eighth graders, I interviewed eighth graders at the end of my study just to kind of get a sense of how their 4 years of schooling at each of these schools shaped them. And even at Heathcliff, the kids, the mostly wealthy white kids that went there, talked about how they would show up and like having to speak with confidence about themselves, about their digital play in the classroom was really scary. I mean, some of them, they talked about crying after how they had, I mean, these are fifth graders, remember, crying after they had to go up in front of the classroom and like show themselves and share their work, and teachers would relentlessly make them practice to go up in front of the screen, use a smartboard, an interactive smartboard, to show themselves, show their creativity. And that was a socialization process that helped kids develop that confidence with digital tools in practice. And this is, I think, something that's missing from a lot of Bourdieuian work that I think over focuses on parents and what happens at home. Because yes, parents are teaching their kids all sorts of things, but kids still have to practice doing those, exerting those habits and skills in the classroom environment.
Mm-hmm.
And, in the classroom environment, there's still a process of like trying it out. And a lot of that depends on the feedback that you get from teachers. And as I show, they're getting very different messaging from teachers depending on the race and class population of the school.
See, that's a very profound insight to me, because you can teach your children what you want as strategies at home. The question is when you send them out into the world to deploy these strategies,
Mm-hmm.
does their firsthand experience validate the message that you're smart, your ideas are great? And if you set your kid in an environment where every, thought that crosses their mind gets applause, they'll be like, wow, I'm really good at making ideas.
Yes.
And
Yep.
I could see the same thing happening in a reverse situation where a parent at home says, you can be anything and just be forthright with your ideas. And if they go to school and the teacher doesn't reward them, it's like a disconfirmation. Like if there's one thing I know with as a parent is kids don't take your life's lessons at face value. They go out and check them, and they're very happy when your advice fails. So it's like they're looking to refute your theories.
I was about to ask a similar question. It seems to me that the kids in this Sheldon school have some kind of dissonance, like there seems to be the parents' piece involvement in the school is missing. And then as you said, some of them are also having their cell phone IPs tracked, right? So there's literally like interfere in the kids' privacy. And if I were their parents, I would definitely interfere. I would go to the school and saying that you are tracking my kids' cell phone. This sounds dodgy, and somehow the parents are not interfering. So I'm curious, like, what is that? Like, are these teachers exercising as an extension of the stereotype of the tiger moms on the kids? That's literally the image that I had in mind. when you were talking that the teachers are more strict with these Asian kids than others.
Yeah, I think at Sheldon specifically, where teachers felt like it was every man for himself among each other, and they, these white teachers then drew on stereotypes of Asian American students as tiger mom raised hackers and not model minorities as they've done elsewhere, that they then applied that to the kids and interactions with those students and their families. And I think importantly, this example counters the notion of technological determinism, which I think, unfortunately, a lot of us as sociologists really fall into this like not nuanced thinking that like technology just does what technology does. If I have a laptop, it will be used in a certain way. No. Um, Sociological phenomena like that, like those perceptions of kids, shapes this threat orientation and stereotype of Asian American kids, that shapes the very meaning and value of all the digital tools at teachers' disposal. That shapes how they have decided to use internet access as surveillance tools. That shapes one of the things I found so fascinating was I remember when I showed up at Sheldon, I was like, why don't teachers have smart boards at this school? Smart boards being these like newfangled blackboards that are digitized and you can do all sorts of things. I was like, is it because of money? And I found no, like they had plenty of funding for technology available at this school. The reason why they didn't buy smart boards is because they wanted to encourage teachers to get up away from the front of the room and walk around and look at what students are doing on their devices. They wanted to use technologies for that purpose. So even the purchase and use of digital tools was for that purpose. I mean, I think you bring up a really good point is that like, oh my gosh, like how do parents not know about this stuff? Or like they're using all these, like we are in an environment now where there isn't a lot of attention to what schools are doing with these technologies, how they're using them with kids, what's happening with students' data. I mean, there just isn't a lot of discussion and education around this. And I think it's vitally important. I think we're just, I'm just not seeing, I'm not seeing a lot of, in particular, communication to parents and kids about how they are using their tools and the ways that they are.
But even if like, even imagine a classroom where the teacher is encouraging students to be creative, to create intellectual property as opposed to implement other people's plans. Like, I would wager that students who have a pen and paper classroom and that type of teaching would be better off than those who are teaching students to basically, fulfill someone else's job orders with like the best computers in front of them. No, like what do you feel about the balance between the ability to use technology and the message implicit in the education that sort of assigns you a role in the social hierarchy? It's almost like they feel like two independent factors almost, are they?
I don't know. I think that whether or not you are using technology in the classroom, and this was pre-COVID when I was studying this stuff. Now it's like you kind of
Yeah.
have to do it.
Right.
But whether, when the discussion is whether or not you use technology in the classroom, I'm a little indifferent, I think what matters most is teaching kids that who they are creatively, whether it be with a pen and paper or with an iPad or laptop, is a valuable asset to their trajectory as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to me, I think that matters more than, laboring over, which technologies we use or how we integrate
Mm-hmm.
them in class. And I don't think, as much as there's been done in the education space about interest-driven learning is usually what it's called, like a lot, I it's not done in practice. And I think what's especially harrowing about this is driven learning is really only seen as feasible or doable when you're serving white kids. The interests of minoritized students are usually seen as threatening or irrelevant to school. And this has been documented for a very long time. And I think if we can address that, if we can address the kind of biases that the mostly white teachers have in schools, if we can address the workplace conditions that teachers are dealing with so that they feel safe, so that teachers themselves feel safe and enabled to confront, uh, racism that they're a part of and that they enable and that all of us are exposed to in our society, then I think that will help kids, irrespective of tech.
Do you really think that it's about teachers feeling safe though? Because they seem quite vulnerable in the private school context. A parent can really wreak havoc on a teacher's career. And in the context of a public school, especially if they're unionized, an individual parent presents far less a personal threat. An angry parent would present far less of a personal threat
Yep.
to a teacher.
That's a really good question. I think how I would answer it focuses on, if we're focusing on kids and differences in not just class, but in race and how kids are treated, what are the conditions that teachers need to be able to not have such horrible, racial stereotypes employed in the classroom?
Okay.
To me,
Yeah.
that's the end goal. And if that's the case, then I would expect from my work that we would need to create workplace conditions, whether it be family like safety or whether it be, really held to it by the parents, the private school, whatever it is at the workplace that enables them to have discussions, professional development experiences that enable them to confront racial biases. I think there's a whole lot of work out there already on the effectiveness of diversity programs and confronting implicit biases and all of that stuff. And I would really defer to those scholars and their recommendations for how to effectively create an environment for that. But I think from my work, I we just need to create an environment where white people can confront the racial stereotypes that they have and address them. Another twist on this too is, let's change the demographic of teachers in schools. Why are we still a
Yeah.
majority white teaching population that doesn't match the student populations that are being taught? That could be another avenue, again, where
Yeah.
the goal is to ensure that all kids, no matter their race, ethnicity, or class, are being treated fairly. That's kind of my long-winded take on your, I think, very good question.
That the idea that you were conveying in the book, though, that kids that are higher on the social hierarchy are being encouraged to be intellectual property producers, and as you move further down, students are being pushed more to implement plans and consume plans, was really, really striking. And it makes me think that the information economy is has a lot less to do with computing and technology than we might realize. A lot of it is sort of just the reproduction of old sort of old differences and what people are encouraged to do.
Yeah, I think so. There's more of us studying digital tech now among sociologists than there was even when I was in graduate school 5 or 6 years ago. But
Mhm.
I remember as a first year grad student telling people I wanted to study tech, and everybody was like, "Oh, don't study digital technology. Digital technology is just a newfangled thing. We got to focus on the sociology, on the sociological phenomena." And I resisted that for so long, but at a certain point in my analysis, I was like, oh man, they're right. It is. There's, social reproduction, all these theories really are inflected in the very same uses of technology that we're talking about today. I
Hmm.
will say, though, that some differences that are really worth calling out and that I really think sociologists should study is the extent to which these social forces we've studied for a very long time are affecting how people are participating online. Because that, I think, is something that's a little different. And I rest on the shoulders of scholars from communications departments and informatics departments who talk about the internet today not as a singular public, to draw on Habermas, but as a series of online publics. Basically meaning that there's many stages online. You could be playing around on TikTok. You could be searching, contemporary GeoCities, like an online forum, a website. That what you do in one place online is a stage, but it can really bleed into context. It can be shared. That data is durable. And so I think there's a new environment by which sociological phenomena that we study can be mapped to what digital participation looks like. And to kind of ground it in this book, I map out how schools are gatekeeping in ways that, at Heathcliff, their digital interests are essential. At Sheldon, they're threatening. And at Chavez, they're irrelevant. And they're serving different race and class populations. What I find with interviews with 8th graders of each of these schools is that they're internalizing this messaging in ways that shape how they then decide to participate online, whether or not that they're at school. So at Heathcliff, the school serving mostly wealthy white kids, where they're teaching kids that their creativity is essential, these kids describe their digital participation as essential to achievement. And what that looked like is that they would use Instagram, Twitter, hell, even, apologies, shouldn't be swearing. They would use Twitter, Instagram, Facebook as a way to demonstrate their worth to future colleges and employers. I mean, these kids even had 8th graders had LinkedIn accounts for kind of showing their worth, in the hopes that someday a college admissions official will see them and think that they're valuable. Skip to other schools, like Chavez, where they told them what they did online was irrelevant. They would then play online thinking that what they didn't matter to schools. And so they're not curating a digital resume at all. And so I think that there's a lot of ripe area for study for how this digital participation might be affected by social forces that sociologists have been studying for a very long time.
You've been listening to the Annex, a Sociology podcast. A special thank you to Matt Rafalow from Google. His book is Digital Divisions, How Schools Create Inequality in the Tech Era, with the University of Chicago Press. We're on the web, theannexpodcast.com, on Facebook, The Annex Sociology Podcast, and on Twitter, @SocAnnex. The Annex is a production of the Queen's Podcast Lab. For more information, visit queenspodcastlab.org. Music is by Lena Orsa. On behalf of Ellen Meiser and Natan, I'm Joe Cohen. Thanks for listening.